Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cohn, and it's my delight to serve as host for this podcast series. Today, our guest is Katie Stowe, a legal industry leader in marketing, business development, EDI, ESG, and pro bono. And she is the founder of a firm called Impact Matters, which supports and guides future-proof law firms. So we're going to start, Katie, by having you tell us about your career and how did you get into ESG and sustainability?
All right. Well, firstly, thank you for having me, Pam. It's wonderful to be here with you. I really am a legal marketer by trade. My whole career has been in legal marketing, so going on 22 years now. And as my career matured, I trended more into business development, ultimately working in client relationship management when I was at Clifford Chance in 2008. And that's really where I was supporting specific client relationships globally. And this was work that I brought back to Canada. I've really stayed connected to ever since, and work that I'm really passionate about. And it was through this work that I got involved in EDI. And that became a full-time role for me for a couple of years at Norton Rose Fulbright. And this really came about because in sitting in relationship review meetings with general counsel, hearing directly from in-house teams, we could see EDI rising up the agenda and becoming an increasing priority for a lot of these large global institutional clients. And so we created a role out of this. We felt around 2019, an immense pressure from clients to increase transparency around this. So my focus really became on amplifying our EDI efforts internally through our client relationships. So how do we report to clients? How do we share and protect demographic diversity data? How do we demonstrate progress? But also, how do we bring clients and markets along in the process? So one of our goals at NRF, and I think a lot of law firms will share this, is you don't want EDI to just be this standalone function, right? Like, you want that to be embedded in the business and something that everybody takes responsibility for. But that can take some education and some awareness raising internally. So part of my role was that as well, because I was within clients and markets. I was kind of bringing them along the journey with me. And so that played out in different ways of how we actually went to market and different ways that we would create more inclusion in those approaches. So that was an amazing role. And from there, it grew really quickly. So I eventually had oversight over the entire impact portfolio. So that included social impact, otherwise known as CSR, pro bono, and sustainability. And I worked with two amazing women. One headed up social impact and sustainability, the other headed up pro bono. And they were both, tremendous inspirations for me. I learned so much from them. And they really, ignited a spark in me to leverage my BD experience and drive some of these practices in law firms. So fast forward to now, that's what I'm trying to do. I feel like NRF was pioneering in a lot of ways in those areas, and now I want to see where I can take that in the industry more broadly.
And so you started your own consulting practice. Tell me about that, when it happened, and how have you enjoyed the experience so far? I know it's early on, but
Yeah, it's early, although I've been planning for months. I really only just launched publicly a week ago, so really early days. But I thought going out on my own would be a bit lonely, and it's actually been the opposite.
Mhm.
Because I think when you've got, I was at NRF for 10 years, and prior to that, I was always at firms for large chunks of time, and you kind of get your head down and you're in your own internal networks within those firms. Maybe it was COVID as well, but I, going out on my own, had to kind of reignite all of these external connections and relationships. And so that has meant, a lot of meetings with people, a lot of reconnecting. Even when I was in Toronto recently, connecting with loads of my Denton's colleagues before NRF. And that has been actually really amazing. I've been so surprised, actually, just by how people have embraced what I'm doing and how supportive they've been. So far it's been really fun, really exciting, also terrifying sometimes, being a team of one and trying to figure out. There's so many times where I've wished I could call the NRF IT department to save me from what I'm doing, but it's a process, and everything that I'm learning on my own is really rewarding.
So I'm curious, the name of your firm is Impact Matters, which I think is a really clever, witty name. Tell me how you came up with it, and then I'll get to my next question, which is related. But first, tell me how you generated that name. I think it's really nice.
Well, thank you. I loved the word impact. I was seeing, we used this at NRF, and I would see certain people who I really looked up to, like Alison Taylor, for example. She used a lot of these references in her book Higher Ground, talking about the importance of understanding your impact as a business, and specifically on people. So I wanted to kind of root it in that word that I felt was positive, it was focused, it was charged with meaning. And in a way, kind of putting that question to law firms, like, are you thinking about your impact on the world? Are you thinking about how what you do affects your people, your clients, your future recruits, the communities you operate in? And even beyond that, like, are you connecting impact to profitability? And if you are, I definitely want to work with you, because those are the people I'm talking to. And the second part of it, like, we talk a lot about materiality in this space, focusing on what matters, because you cannot be everything to everybody. And that's a tricky thing for law firms in a partnership structure, of finding that balance of how do you have like a laser focus when you're also trying to appease a lot of different people who are all really important stakeholders. And also I just love the double meaning of that in the legal context. So it's stuck.
That's why I thought it was so clever, because it clearly fits in the legal context as well. So describe to me what your ideal client would be or is, and what is your ideal work? What is your sweet spot?
Yes, and I think this will refine as I go, but right out of the gate, I'm looking to work with law firms of all sizes and all different stages of maturity. But really what would be defining them is like a firm that wants to lead, a firm that's, willing to do things differently and perhaps looks to other industries for inspiration. Firms that have like a clear understanding of who they are, what they represent, or if they don't, then a willingness to figure that out. And most importantly, open to change, because I'm not interested in standing still, and I want to do things differently, and that I find really inspiring and really fun. So I think for smaller law firms, there could be some great work around firm strategy more broadly. Who are we? Where are we going? How do we modernize our practices for this current market? So maybe some upskilling, training, fractional CMO type roles. For larger firms, I can see it being a bit more project specific. So where a firm maybe is lacking a key account management program, helping get in and build that and get that operationalized, or a client listening program, or social projects. Like there's a couple of law firms who are in the process of going through the Progressive Aboriginal Relations certification process. That's run through CCAB, and that's a big undertaking for law firms. It's a multi-year process. It takes a lot of work and commitment to get that done. So that type of thing where I can step in and help project manage, having gone through that process before. So I think it will kind of, run a spectrum, and I'm keen to just follow the direction of the market, of what people are, meeting firms where they're at, because there's so many different ways that you can kind of build ESG practices into what you're doing without necessarily, starting with a ESG strategy. There's just so many layers to it. And like weaving in EDI practices as well to all of that.
So that leads very nicely into my next question, because this is such a fast evolving area, the whole ESG umbrella. What do you think is in store? And we're halfway through 2024 already. So let's say, what do you think is in store for 2024 and 2025? ESG related, under the ESG umbrella. What's on the horizon?
Well, I think, and some of these themes really came through, like the Legal ESG Toronto conference. And I think what we're hearing is there's still a lot of uncertainty, of course. And in Canada specifically, we're behind on several fronts. We have some new regulations, but we are definitely behind other markets in that regard. So I think clients are looking at, what is next? How is this going to continually evolve, specifically with regulations? What might change in the next year, and what will be the ripple down effect of that as we're trying to operationalize? And fears over having to pivot too dramatically on that. And we've just completed, Canada's just gone through its first cycle of reporting on Bill S-211. I think there might be some reflections coming out of that process. And it will be interesting. Like, I will be keenly watching and listening for that, just to see how it's gone, how that might evolve, because of course it's only a transparency process. And that is different to other markets, right?
Yeah.
So
tell me briefly for our listeners, what is S-211?
That is, in other words, the Modern Slavery Act. So the first reporting cycle just ended in May. And so for all of those entities who have had to disclose and report, that's done now, and that information is going to be publicly accessible. But I think a lot of people are commenting that they're not expecting it to change behavior necessarily, because it didn't come with certain expectations. It was really about creating transparency. So how will that evolve? Like, will it become more? Will it, get closer aligned to international regulations like CSRD, which is, next level? So that will be, I think, a thing to watch. I also feel like we're going to continue to see like a bit of splitting of the pack of law firms. Like, I always look to the UK for inspiration, because having worked there, I felt and experienced how much further ahead they were in a lot of ways in the legal industry. And I wanted to think that we had caught up more closely, but I don't think we have. And I'm just seeing this play out now with ESG. When I look at the quality of the conversations, the scope and the size of conversations within London firms specifically, they're just at a very different place than we are in Canada. Even just like looking at B Corp certification, it's been a couple of years now that UK-based firms were exploring that, and those numbers are increasing in terms of firms going for that. And that's not a conversation I see here. So I feel like the UK is going to get even further ahead than Canada this year in that, and they are just really outpacing Canadian law firms in terms of how they're looking internally at their own businesses. I don't think, like, scope 3, for example, I don't think a lot of law firms are tuned into that piece of it for themselves as a business. And you definitely hear that from UK firms, that they are very focused on that.
Yeah.
So maybe a Canadian law firm leader will emerge in the next year. That would be great to see somebody try to play that role, because I think that role is there for the taking. I don't think anybody is a clear leader at this point in terms of their internal focus. They're all obviously doing great things externally, advising clients.
Meaning serving clients.
Exactly.
Yeah, but don't necessarily have their own house in order.
Yeah. So I think we could hopefully see a Canadian leader emerge on that front. Maybe some more sustainability oriented roles within law firms. Right now, for a lot, that's sitting within operations, which I think is a fine solution, but there's not many people in that space. In terms of topics, I think we're going to continue to see dialogue around the politics with all of the elections happening globally. Like, we will see that still play out all year. But I do think people are tiring of the backlash narrative. Now there's like backlash on the backlash. I think people are getting a bit over that. Even though we are still hearing people talk about, should we use the term ESG? Should we not? I think, real life is just carrying on. For the people who are in these spaces, there's work to do. There are absolute certain requirements that have to be met. That conversation is a distraction that I think people are just kind of starting to get over.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
Maybe it's just me, but I'm kind of over it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the people who are in this space, they see very clearly that this isn't going away, because really, if you break it down, we're all talking about mitigating risk and generating long-term value creation, which is very hard to argue against.
That's right. That's right.
So,
and to your point, while we are all, I would say this particularly true here in the US, debating whether ESG is the term to use or not, the EU and the UK are marching forward at rapid speed, and we're getting further and further behind in our behavior and steps that need to be taken here. And to your point earlier about looking to London, if there is a Canadian firm that is going to emerge as a leader, there are really some fine examples in the London marketplace of firms that have embraced ESG and have it's now strategic to their mission, to their purpose, and they're going gangbusters while we debate what acronym to use.
Yeah, absolutely. It is beside the point. It's
exactly
really immaterial.
Yep.
I think we'll also continue to see, and this is something we talked about in Toronto recently, but rising employee activism. I think this is going to evolve into a conversation around like a redefinition of what's appropriate. What is the appropriate role for an organization? What's the appropriate role for employees in representing a stance on social issues? Because I feel like this is, for a lot of organizations, feeling out of control. And you can start to see those conversations are emerging within universities, for example. Harvard is talking about this right now. So I think that will be something that's continually still on the agenda and talked about right now, because it is creating a lot of challenges for organizations. And I think in that respect too, like sticking with the social piece, we're going to see like a continual conversation around supporting mental wellness in the legal profession. I think that topic has really come to the forefront in the last 6 months, at least in the circles I'm in. I see it as a more prominent conversation than I have in prior years. And I think that's really important. And I hope that continues, that focus continues. In Canada too, I feel this will continue to be important, and that is, you might have noticed at the conference too, a lot of Canadians will add an I to ESG, so ESGI. I haven't seen that necessarily in other markets. I think it is a very important distinction for Canada, though, and that's that continual recognition of the importance of incorporating Indigenous perspectives in ESG conversations. I see more and more people talking about that, which I think is great, and I hope that continues to gain prominence into the next year. And
And
beyond that,
in that respect, I would say Canada is certainly ahead of the US, and maybe even ahead of some of the UK firms that we were talking about being so much more mature on their journey. I think Canada is actually a leader when it comes to recognition of and incorporation of Indigenous rights.
yeah, I think so too. And I think it's also a great example of materiality, right, which we touched on before. Like, this won't be the same for every jurisdiction, because
Right.
you need to respond to and reflect the uniqueness of your environment and your people. So I think that it makes sense for Canada, and I'm glad to see that happening.
Yeah, I completely agree. My favorite question to end with is, because these are such challenging times in this workspace, ESG, DE&I, all the things we've talked about, what gives you hope? I mean, what made you start a firm in order to address this? Because it's quite a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I think it is really, it's passion, and it's taking inspiration from other people who have also charted out on this course where they are trying to do something different, and lead the way. I've seen and been inspired by so many people who, some of which I've only met virtually,
Mhm.
um, and many of whom I've met through like the legal ESG events, which I feel like have really built a community of people who, they're all giving me hope, and I think it's created like this really amazing momentum in our industry. But I also get hope from just looking at, having been in the industry for my whole career, I can still remember what it looked and felt like 20 years ago. And so when I actually stop and pause and reflect on that, it is amazing to me what has changed in 20 years. Like, the work that I have done, even in the last decade, like I wouldn't have dreamed of doing when I was fresh out of university walking into my first law firm. And so, it can feel like everything is changing so slowly and progress is so slow. But having been here for this duration, I'm actually like really inspired by what has changed and what conversations have started and what spaces that people are welcoming me into, when 20 years ago it would never have even been a thought on anyone's radar. So I'm hoping that you know, maybe the pace will pick up a little bit, and now through globalization, um, we will, like, the pressure that will create change will just come a bit faster for all of us.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Those of us who have been in the legal profession for a long time, and my years are more than your years. And if you look back at what it was like 25 or 30 years ago and how far we've come, you're right. Progress has been made. Obvious progress has been made. But when you're in it, it feels so slow. Like you forget what it was like a year ago or 2 years ago. And if you take that time frame, you can see progress. But it's not fast and it's not quick. And I think you're right. It will be external pressures that will force some of this change, just like your comment earlier about the GCs, having very poignant conversations with their outside firms about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think the same thing is happening now on other ESG elements. The outside pressure will come from stakeholders and, of course, regulations.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for sharing about your journey and about your new firm. We wish you all the best of luck, and we'll talk again in a year's time and see where you are.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.